She walked into federal court in San Jose on a Tuesday morning. She wore black, as she always had. Her lawyers flanked her on both sides. The courtroom was packed. The woman who had once graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune, who had shaken hands with four sitting presidents, who had been worth $9 billion on paper, was about to face a jury of her peers. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes, and the product she had sold to the world had never actually worked, not once, not ever. The question that everyone in that courtroom carried was the same question investigators had been asking for years. How do you build a company worth $10 billion on a technology that doesn't exist? The answer is more disturbing than you think because it wasn't a glitch. It wasn't bad science that got out of hand. According to prosecutors, it was a deliberate and sustained lie, a lie told to patients, to investors, to partners, to the government. And for over a decade, the entire world believed it. This is the story of Theranos. She was 19 years old when she dropped out of Stanford, not because she was failing, she was thriving. But Elizabeth Holmes had read about a fear so primal, so universal, that she believed solving it could make her the richest person on earth. The fear of needles, the fear of blood draws, the fear of waiting days for results that could change your life. According to her own later testimony, she wanted to democratize healthcare. She founded Theranos in 2003. The name was a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis. She was not yet old enough to rent a car without a surcharge. Her pitch was simple, and it was extraordinary. A single drop of blood from a fingertip, run on a proprietary device called the Edison, capable of detecting hundreds of diseases simultaneously, cheaper than traditional labs, faster, more accurate. If true, it would have been one of the greatest medical breakthroughs in a generation. The investors lined up, not cautiously, enthusiastically. Theranos raised over $900 million in private funding, according to SEC filings and court documents. Among its backers were the DeVos family, the Walton family, Rupert Murdoch, and the Cox family media empire. Not one of them was a healthcare specialist. Holmes cultivated a board of directors that looked less like a biotech company and more like a national security briefing. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, General James Mattis, William Perry, former senators, former cabinet secretaries. By 2015, Forbes valued Holmes personally at $4.5 billion. Fortune named her the youngest self-made female billionaire in history. Time magazine named her one of the 100 most influential people in the world. She wore the same black turtleneck every day. She lowered her natural voice to a baritone. She spoke about death and suffering and changing the world. Silicon Valley loved every word. Walgreens signed a deal. Safeway signed a deal. The United States military explored deployment in war zones. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services was paying attention. The world had decided that Elizabeth Holmes was the next Steve Jobs. Some people inside Theranos were not so sure. John Carreyrou was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. In 2015, a source reached out to him. The information was specific. The accusations were extraordinary. The Edison device, Theranos' flagship technology, could not reliably perform the tests the company claimed. For most of its tests, Theranos was using conventional third-party machines made by Siemens and other manufacturers. The fingertip blood draws were often abandoned in favor of traditional venous blood draws. Results were being reported to patients with alarming inaccuracy. Carey-Rue began to investigate. He would later write that sources came to him slowly and with tremendous fear. Theranos had signed employees to some of the most aggressive non-disclosure agreements in Silicon Valley history. According to court documents, employees who raised concerns internally were fired. Some were threatened with legal action. Erica Chung was a lab associate at Theranos. She had joined the company believing in its mission. What she found inside was something different. She later told prosecutors and the court that results were being manipulated. Quality controls were failing. The machines were producing inconsistent outputs, and those inconsistencies were not being disclosed to doctors or patients. Tyler Schultz, grandson of George Schultz, worked briefly at Theranos as a scientist. He raised internal concerns about testing accuracy in 2014. According to his own later testimony, Holmes herself confronted him. He resigned. He then contacted the California Public Health Department. Theranos' lawyers from the firm Boies Schiller Flexner, one of the most aggressive litigation firms in the United States, sent letters to his home address. According to Tyler Schultz's own account, private investigators followed him. He was 22 years old. Inside the company, a different crisis was building. The Edison device was fundamentally broken. According to documents later introduced at trial, internal validation studies showed the machine produced wildly variable results. One internal study showed the device giving different readings from the same blood sample run back to back. The company's own scientists knew, senior executives knew, according to federal prosecutors, Holmes knew, but the partnerships were still running. The Walgreens stores were still open. The patients were still getting results. Doctors were still making treatment decisions based on those results. Some patients, according to court testimony, received false positives for cancer. Others received false negatives for serious conditions. Real people were receiving life-altering medical information from a machine that didn't work. On October 16th, 2015, John Carreyrou's story ran in the Wall Street Journal. The headline read, "Hot startup Theranos has struggled with its blood test technology." The company did not collapse quietly. Holmes went on television. She appeared on CNBC and called the story, quote, inaccurate and grossly wrong. She told Mad Money host Jim Cramer that Theranos ran its Edison device on all its tests. That was not true. According to documents later produced in federal court, Theranos ran the Edison on fewer than 12 of the approximately 240 tests it offered. Boies Schiller sent a letter to the Wall Street Journal. Theranos hired a crisis communications firm. The board, the former secretaries of state, the retired generals, they stood behind her. But the regulators were already moving. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, known as CMS, conducted an inspection of Theranos' Newark, California laboratory in 2015 and 2016. What they found, according to their own published reports, was a laboratory in serious violation of federal standards. Proficiency testing was being handled improperly. Quality control systems were inadequate. Patient safety was at risk. In July 2016, CMS took extraordinary action. They revoked Theranos' laboratory certification. They banned Elizabeth Holmes from operating or owning a clinical laboratory for 2 years. They proposed civil monetary penalties of nearly $500,000. This was not a fine. This was a verdict. Walgreens terminated its partnership. Safeway terminated its partnership. Safeway had spent $400 million building out health clinic spaces specifically to house Theranos equipment. That money was gone. The company began to implode. Staff left. Investors lost access to information. And in March 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Elizabeth Holmes and former President Ramesh Sunny Balwani with massive fraud. Holmes agreed to settle with the SEC without admitting or denying guilt. She paid a $500,000 fine. She was barred from serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years, and she returned the shares she still held in Theranos, but the Department of Justice wanted more. In June 2018, a federal grand jury indicted both Holmes and Balwani on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The indictment alleged they had defrauded investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars and defrauded doctors and patients by providing false and misleading test results. They were facing up to 20 years in federal prison. She had a baby. She got engaged. She delayed the trial through a pandemic. And when the jury finally heard the case, what they were deciding was this. Was Elizabeth Holmes a con artist who knew her technology didn't work? Or was she a true believer, a visionary who had made serious mistakes? The answer the jury came back with was more complicated than anyone expected. Stay with us. The trial of Elizabeth Holmes began in August 2021 in San Jose, California. It lasted 4 months. Over 80 witnesses testified. The prosecution played recordings of Holmes's own voice, pitching investors, making specific technical claims that federal prosecutors said she knew were false. According to documents admitted at trial, Holmes had altered a validation report from Pfizer to make it appear Pfizer had endorsed the Edison device. Pfizer had not. The modifications were made in Theranos' own document editing software. Holmes took the stand in her own defense. It was a calculated gamble, and it included a claim that stunned the courtroom. She testified that she had been in an abusive relationship with Ramesh Balwani, her former business partner and romantic partner. She said he had psychologically controlled her, that he had shaped her decisions, that she had been a victim inside her own company. Balwani's defense team disputed this account entirely. On January 3rd, 2022, The jury delivered its verdict on Holmes, guilty on 4 counts, 3 counts of wire fraud against investors, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud against investors, not guilty on 4 counts related to defrauding patients. The jury was hung on 3 additional counts. It was a partial verdict, but it was enough. In November 2022, Judge Edward Davila sentenced Elizabeth Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. He also ordered her to pay restitution of $452 million. She appealed. She lost. In May 2023, Elizabeth Holmes reported to a federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas. She had given birth to a second child months before reporting. She was 39 years old. Ramesh Balwani was tried separately. His jury was less sympathetic. In July 2022, he was convicted on all 12 counts against him. In December 2022, he was sentenced to nearly 13 years in federal prison. The company itself was already long dead. Theranos dissolved in September 2018. It had raised over $900 million from investors. The final liquidation returned essentially nothing. The patients who had received inaccurate test results were never systematically identified. No comprehensive review was ever conducted to determine how many medical decisions had been affected. According to reporting by the Wall Street Journal and other outlets, Theranos itself processed millions of blood tests from 2013 to 2016. Some of those results were accurate, some were not. No one has ever produced a definitive accounting. The regulatory response was significant but targeted. CMS tightened oversight of laboratory testing. California introduced legislation to increase transparency for lab-developed tests. The SEC brought additional scrutiny to private unicorn companies that had avoided public market disclosure requirements. But the fundamental question that Theranos exposed, the question of how a private company could raise nearly $1 billion with minimal scientific peer review, with no independent validation of its core technology, that question has not been answered with new law. The venture capital ecosystem that funded Theranos, that celebrated Holmes on every stage, that placed former generals and secretaries of state on a board that never demanded a technical audit. It remains largely intact. No investor faced criminal charges. No board member was sanctioned. The money was simply gone. Here is the thing that stays with you after you read every filing, every trial transcript, every internal email. Theranos was not a mystery. It was hiding in plain sight. The scientific community had been skeptical for years. Peer-reviewed literature on the limits of fingertip blood testing existed long before Carreyrou published his first story. The absence of any published validation data from Theranos, from a company claiming revolutionary accuracy, should have been disqualifying. But this was Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley had a rule: fake it till you make it. That phrase is treated as wisdom in startup culture, as philosophy, as permission. What Theranos revealed is that in medicine, that philosophy kills people. Holmes was not the first person to oversell a technology. She will not be the last. What made Theranos different, what made it catastrophic, was the domain. Software that doesn't work loses money. Diagnostic tests that don't work lose lives. The investors who lost money were sophisticated. The patients who received false results were not. They trusted the brand. They trusted the partnership with Walgreens. They trusted the laboratory certification, not knowing it would be revoked. They trusted the diagnosis. Power is most dangerous, not when it lies to regulators, but when it lies to the powerless. Elizabeth Holmes told a story about herself so completely, so relentlessly, that she convinced some of the most powerful people in the world. Maybe she convinced herself too. We'll probably never know for certain. What we know is what the jury decided. What we know is what the evidence showed. And what we know is that at the end of it all, a drop of blood from a fingertip and a machine in a Walgreens could not do what Elizabeth Holmes said it could. Not once, not ever. What's your verdict? Was Elizabeth Holmes a calculated fraudster from the beginning, or did a real vision simply become a desperate lie somewhere along the way? Drop your answer in the comments. The debate has been raging since 2015, and there is still no consensus. If this kind of story is what you're here for, subscribe now. Next up on this channel, we go inside the collapse of WeWork, the $106 billion company built on free beer and borrowed time. You won't want to miss it.